I request to our president, Sri Prashant Kadam sir, to start the program.
नमस्कार.
sir.
ठाणे जिल्हा वकील संघटना आयोजित व्याख्यानमालेतील आजचं 11वे व्याख्यान. मी सर्वांचं स्वागत करतो या व्याख्यानाकरता. आजचे वक्ते आहेत सुप्रीम कोर्टातील ज्येष्ठ व नामवंत वकील श्री शेखर नाफडे सर. सरांचं पण मी स्वागत करतो. मी ॲडव्होकेट रुपालींना सरांचा थोडक्यात परिचय देण्यापूर्वी एक गोष्ट मला आवर्जून सांगावीशी वाटते की 3 दिवसापूर्वी जेव्हा मी सरांना व्याख्यानाबाबत विचारणा केली होती, आपल्या विचारणेला किंवा आपल्या विनंतीला मान देऊन तात्काळ होकार दिला. मी संघटनेतर्फे सरांचा आभार मानतो आणि मी ॲडव्होकेट रुपाली म्हात्रे यांना सरांचा थोडक्यात परिचय देण्याकरता विनंती करतो. धन्यवाद.
थँक्यू सर. गुड मॉर्निंग. नमस्कार सर्वांना. मी ॲडव्होकेट रुपाली विठोबा म्हात्रे, चेअरपर्सन आणि कमिटी मेंबर, TDCBA एक्स चेअरपर्सन अँड कमिटी मेंबर. TDCBA आयोजित 11व्या व्याख्यान मालिकेत आपल्या सर्वांचं मनापासून स्वागत करते. आज आपल्याला लाभलेले वक्ते आहेत सुप्रीम कोर्ट ऑफ इंडियाचे नामांकित वकील, ज्येष्ठ वकील श्री शेखर नाफडे सर. TDCBA व सर्व ऑनलाईन श्रोत्यांतर्फे मी आपले स्वागत करीत आहे. वेलकम सर. गव्हर्नमेंट लॉ ऑफ कॉलेज ऑफ मुंबई येथून कायद्याचे शिक्षण पूर्ण करून 1974 सालापासून सर वकिली व्यवसायात आहेत. सुरुवातीच्या काळात सरांनी सुप्रीम कोर्टाचे न्यायमूर्ती श्री BN श्रीकृष्णन यांचे सोबत काम केले. आतापर्यंत सरांनी जवळजवळ सर्वच म्हणजे सिटी सिव्हिल कोर्ट, कोऑपरेटिव्ह कोर्ट, स्मॉल कॉजेस, क्रिमिनल कोर्ट यामध्ये काम करून आपला ठसा उमटवला आहे. 1976 ते 1979 पर्यंत सरांनी GLC कॉलेज मुंबई येथे लॉ ऑफ टॉर्ट्स, लॉ ऑफ एव्हिडन्स, ऍडमिनिस्ट्रेटिव्ह लॉ, पब्लिक इंटरनॅशनल लॉ यावर विद्यार्थ्यांना मार्गदर्शन केले आहे. 1979 पासून सर सुप्रीम कोर्ट येथे रेग्युलर प्रॅक्टिस करीत असून 2001 पासून ते दिल्ली येथे वास्तव्यास आहेत. 1980 पासून सरांनी हायकोर्ट बॉम्बे येथे वकिली सुरुवात केली व 1998 साली त्यांना सिनियर ॲडव्होकेट म्हणून बॉम्बे हायकोर्ट येथे नियुक्ती करण्यात आली. स्टेट ऑफ महाराष्ट्र, स्टेट ऑफ तमिळनाडू यासाठी सिनियर काउन्सिल म्हणून सरांनी विविध नामांकित केसेस हायकोर्ट व सुप्रीम कोर्ट येथे हाताळल्या आहेत. अगदी उत्कृष्टपणे हाताळल्या आहेत. ललिता कुमारी केस, सुकन्या केस, अरुणा शानबाग केस, सहारा इंडिया केस, इंटरनॅशनल अडॉप्शन रॅकेट केस, जयललिता केस, BCCI क्रिकेट केस, कावेरी इशू, राम जेठमलानी वर्सेस युनियन ऑफ इंडिया केस, तसेच इम्पीचमेंट प्रोसिडिंग फॉर रिमूव्हल ऑफ जस्टिस सौमित्र सिंग, जज ऑफ कॅलकत्ता या त्यापैकी काही नावाजलेल्या केसेस. सरांबद्दल सांगण्यासारखं भरपूर आहे, परंतु आता वेळेअभावी मी त्यांची संक्षिप्त माहिती थोडक्यात सांगितलेली आहे. आपल्या सुदैवाने आज सरांनी आपल्या सर्वांना एव्हिडन्स ऍक्ट अँड इट्स ऍप्लिकेशन इन क्रिमिनल मॅटर्स या विषयावर मार्गदर्शन करण्यासाठी त्यांचा बहुमूल्य वेळ दिलेला आहे. मी त्याबद्दल सर्वांतर्फे व कमिटीतर्फे सरांचे मनापासून आभार मानते व त्यांना विनंती करते की त्यांनी आपले बहुमूल्य मार्गदर्शन आम्हा सर्वांना द्यावे. धन्यवाद.
Thanks for very kind introduction. Today's topic is very vast in its compass, and to connect the essential aspects of this branch of law in an hour's time is a very difficult task. But I will try to do justice to the best of my ability. In the first place, there are three aspects of this branch. One is a inseparable connection between Criminal Procedure Code and the Evidence Act. This is one important aspect. The second important aspect is the rules of evidence contained in the Evidence Act. All rules are based on certain basic concepts. And one of the basic concepts is the rule of best evidence. The provisions of the Evidence Act will briefly examine this doctrine. The third aspect is the appreciation of evidence. These are three distinct aspects. First, let me briefly take you to the provisions of CRPC which directly or indirectly affect the provisions of the Evidence Act or the evidence law in general. The first is Section 291 of the Evidence Act. Criminal Procedure Code. Now, this section lays down that a medical witness can be examined by the magistrate even though the trial has not started, and the evidence so recorded can be read as evidence in the trial. This is subject, of course, to the fact that such evidence must be recorded in the presence of the accused. The second important provision is Section 291A, which is comparatively recently incorporated in CRPC. It deals with executive magistrates who conducts an identification parade. We'll come to this question of identification parade a little later. And his report can be straightaway read as evidence, subject, of course, to the right of the prosecution or accused to call the executive magistrate who conducts the identification parade for deposing in the court. Then we have Section 292 of CRPC, deals with the report of the mint officer or the government note printing press or the security printing press or any examiner, report of any examiner of questioned documents. These documents can straightaway go as evidence without calling those of. Next is Section 293 of CRPC, which deals with the reports of certain scientific officers. See, all these scientific aspects have a lot of bearing on certain subjects like the forensic part, like food adulteration. So these experts, their evidence goes as record of the court directly. Then under Section 191 CRPC, the court has the right to summon any document which may be in the possession of third parties. Then we come to Section 164. Now you will find, analogous to Section 191 CRPC, there is a provision contained in Section 165 of the Evidence Act. Then we have to read Section 164 and Section 281 of CRPC together. Now 164 deals with two aspects. One is the confession of an accused, and the second is the statement of some other witness. Now, as far as the confession is concerned, it can't be on oath, because that will be straightaway hit by Article 20 of the Constitution. But as far as other statements of other witnesses are concerned, they are on oath and the magistrate examines them. Now, recently there is an amendment to CRPC which incorporates Section 164 5 capital A. These are statements recorded by the magistrate on oath of persons who are subject to sexual assaults. In fact, this provision has come as the result of a judgment of the Supreme Court, which had laid down that a moment the rape victim complains to the police, then the statement of the complainant or the prosecutress must be immediately recorded before the magistrate under 164. The reason is obvious, that immediate recording ensures the truthfulness of the allegations, and second, then there is no scope for the police or the interested parties to interfere with the investigation. This is the primary object. Then, if an offense committed by an Indian citizen is outside the territory of India, and if the witnesses are examined by a judicial authority in the foreign country, then that evidence straightaway goes in as evidence as a part of the trial in India that flows from section 188, 189 CRPC. And of course, this has to be read along with section 33 of the Evidence Act. Then we come to sections 161 and 162 CRPC. You are all aware that when the statements of witnesses under section 161 and 162 tells us that such statements cannot be used as evidence in the trial, subject to two exceptions. One is to be used for the purpose of contradiction as contempt section 145 of the Evidence Act, or such statements can go in under section 32 of the Evidence Act. Then we come to section 3 lays down that a person once tried for an offense, he can't be tried again for the same offense. This is to be read with section 40 of the Evidence Act, which permits the judgment of the previous trial to be admitted, which empowers the judge or the magistrate conducting the trial to have local inspection, that is of the spot where the offense is committed, so that he is in a position to appreciate the evidence. And when he does this local inspection, he has to make a memorandum, and that memorandum forms a part of the record of the case. So we briefly saw how CRPC makes an impact on the provisions of the Evidence Act. Now we'll come to the provisions of the Evidence Act. There are two fundamental principles which lie within the rule of relevancy and the rule of admissibility. Now, these expressions are often used interchange between the two. What is relevant is not necessarily admissible, but what is admissible is necessarily relevant. Now, sections 5 to 55 contain provisions which relate to relevancy. I'll just give you an example. A person has no personal knowledge about an offense, but somebody told him that XYZ person has committed an offense. Now, his evidence may be relevant in a logical sense, but he has no personal knowledge. And therefore, section 60 of the Evidence Act, which says that if it relates to a fact which is seen by somebody, it must be the evidence of a person who has seen. If it relates to a fact which could be heard, then it must be the evidence of a person who has heard it. Or if it could be perceived by any other sense, it must be the evidence of a person who has perceived it in that sense. So these are some of the fundamental principles. Now, the Evidence Act contains the positive rules which make out a case of relevancy. But there are negative rules also which prevent the admissibility of such a relevant piece of evidence. Another example is a person confesses to a police officer that he has committed an offense. It is logically relevant. It may be relevant under even section 11 of the Evidence Act, but section 25 lays down that a confession made to a police officer is not admissible in evidence. So therefore, there are positive rules and there are negative rules. Now, let me briefly introduce some of the important provisions of the Evidence Act which have a considerable bearing on the criminal trials. Now, these provisions are sections 5 to 55, which define relevancy. But all these provisions are not very relevant. Some of the most important provisions are section 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 14, 15, 16, 24 to 30, 30 to 33, 40, 300, 300 and 310 are from CRPC. Now, also the provisions relating to documents, which are contained in chapter 5, which are from section 61 to section 99. Now, let me briefly introduce section 6. This is popularly known as hearsay evidence section. Now, what is hearsay? Hearsay is something which a person has heard. He has not personally seen it. But in certain circumstances, hearsay evidence is admissible, or what is known as res gestae. Actually, the nomenclature hearsay is not an appropriate nomenclature, but somehow that nomenclature has come into vogue for various reasons. The correct expression is res gestae. Now, what does it mean? It means something which is a part of a given transaction. Let's take an example. Suppose you are sitting in a restaurant and you see some accident has taken place, and you narrate that to your friend who has not seen the accident and who is sitting with you. Now, what is the main transaction? The main transaction is the accident, which you have seen. Your friend has not seen, but your friend is sitting with you and you tell him, just now an accident took place. So the accident and your narration to your friend become a part of the same transaction. But suppose you go home and tell your wife or your husband that I saw such and such an accident, then it is not res gestae. Not because the lack of time element, because there is no live connection. Now, often res gestae is confused with the time element. What is necessary is that the transaction and what you say or what you do is there is a live connection. Now, if the transaction is continuing, take for example, a widespread conspiracy of terrorists. It begins with collecting arms and ammunition, planning where to attack, and then actual attack. Now, all these steps, planning, connecting the weapons, and actual attack, there is a live contact. And therefore, this is a part of the res gestae. So therefore, the res gestae is an exception to the principle of rule of best evidence. But it is not evidence which is irrelevant. So amongst the relevant facts, or to be precise, facts which are admissible, whenever I use the word relevant, I also mean admissible. But there could be a variety of relevant facts. Some of them conform to the rule of best evidence. Some of them are not a piece of best evidence. Some of them are a weak evidence. But rule of best evidence, not strong evidence, weak evidence, these are matters of appreciation, which falls into the third aspect of the law of evidence, which we'll see, with which we'll deal a little later. Now, sections 7, 8, and 9 are of great importance in criminal trials. What do they deal with? They deal with first preparation, because whenever any offense is committed, there is always a preparation, unless, of course, the person acts under a sudden provocation or something like that. Next is motive. Third is the actual carrying out. Fourth is identity of the object of the offense, what we call as the corpus delicti. Identity has two aspects: identity of a person and identity of a thing. Now, as far as identity is concerned of a person or of the accused, Section 9 has to be read with identification parade, which we saw in Section 291A of CRPC. Now, identification parade of the accused is of some importance when we take up the question of appreciation of evidence. So motive is of great importance in matters where the evidence against the accused is of a circumstantial nature. The failure to establish motive, if there is direct ocular evidence, that is not fatal to the prosecution. But motive can be a corroborative factor, and in certain circumstances, or based on other circumstances, motive can be one of the ingredients, one of the important pieces of evidence for the purpose of convicting. Section 10 then deals with conspiracy. Now, this section presupposes that there is material to believe that two or more persons have conspired to commit an offense. So the foundation of Section 10 is existence of a reasonable ground to believe. Now let's see what is reasonable ground to believe. It does not mean that that ground is shown to exist with a very solid piece of evidence. That is, that evidence is to the hilt is not the test. The test is of a reasonable man, whether two or more persons have come together to commit a particular offense. Now, once Section 10 is attracted, then every act committed by a conspirator is also attributed to his co-conspirator. Let's take an example. If A and B come together to commit an offense of murder, A only acquires the weapon and the B actually shoots. The murder or the attack by B is also attributable to A. In other words, Section 10 introduces a concept of agency in the criminal law. Now, when there are reasonable grounds to believe, etc., is a matter of detail, and it will depend upon the evidence which the prosecution is able to show, is in a position to show as to what constitutes reasonable ground to believe. Then we have Section 11, a very important section. This section has direct connection with a fact in issue and a relevant fact. Now, what is a fact in issue? A fact in issue is defined by the Evidence Act. It means a fact which determines the liability or the extent of his liability for having committed a particular act. Now, say in case of a theft, the fact in issue is whether the accused has committed the offense of theft. Extent of liability means what sentence should be imposed on him. Take case of a murder. Every case of murder does not result in death sentence. That's a fact in issue. whether he has committed the offense of murder, that's a fact in issue. But the circumstances under which he committed the offense, are there any mitigating circumstances? Or are there any aggravating circumstances? I have given the example of murder for the purpose of explaining the principle. This applies to all offenses, whether there were mitigating circumstances or there were aggravating circumstances. So the main offense is a fact in issue, and the mitigating or aggravating circumstances are also facts in issue. Now, what is relevant fact? A relevant fact is that fact which renders the existence or non-existence of a fact in issue probable or improbable. Now, there is thus a vital connection between a fact in issue and a relevant fact. Now, all that section 11 says is that every fact which renders the existence of a fact in issue probable or improbable, or renders another relevant fact probable or improbable, is a relevant fact. It's a very wide definition. It in fact introduces a concept of logical relevancy in the provisions of the Evidence Act. But even if you have satisfied the requirement of section 11 that a particular fact which is relevant because that it renders the existence of a fact in issue or another relevant fact probable or improbable, it does not mean that it is necessarily admissible. I'll give you one example, a very interesting case which I argued in Supreme Court, and it is a case of its own nature, what we call as sui generis. It's a case of State of Maharashtra versus Kamal Ahmed, 2013, volume 12 SCC, page 17. I'll tell you why that case is interesting. There were two groups of terrorists. This relates to the bomb blasts in Bombay. There were two groups of terrorists. Now, in respect of one bomb blast case, the accused ABC were being tried. In another bomb blast case, accused XYZ were being prosecuted. Now, the accused X makes a confession to a police officer that the offense is not committed by ABC, but I have committed the offense. Under the provisions of the TADA Act, a police officer of a certain rank was competent to record confession. This is an exception to the provision contained in sections 24, 25, 26 of the Evidence Act. So the accused ABC wanted to call that police officer to give evidence of confession made by X. The strategy was that if the evidence relating to the confession of X is established, then the guilt lies with X and not with ABC, and thus the very foundation of the prosecution case comes to an end. Now see what I argued and what was accepted by the Supreme Court. I said prima facie, this argument is very attractive. Normally, the confession made by the accused to the police officer is admissible in view of peculiar provisions of the TADA Act. But this does not conform to the rule of best evidence. What is the best evidence? The best evidence is of that X accused, who is accused in another bomb blast case. ABC must examine that accused X, who is charged in another case. It is only if he is examined and he makes a confession before the court, then only that evidence is admissible. Now this argument was accepted. I am still not sure whether I was right in contending. I am still not sure whether the court was right. But having regard to the fact that a confession recorded by a police officer is not a best piece of evidence, and if you see several judgments, even confession recorded under 164 CRPC by magistrate, the courts have rarely used it as substantive evidence. They have always used it as corroborative. But this is where the law stands. Now let's see what is 1415. 1415 deal with the state of mind. One is whether the accused has committed an offense with a dishonest mind, dishonest intention. Now, the science and technology has advanced a lot, but even now, there is no means of entering into the mind of the accused for the purpose of finding out whether he had a dishonest intention. His dishonest intention can be gathered only from circumstances. Now take an example like a person who deals with stolen goods. Now, if on one occasion he is found to be in possession of stolen good, he may come out with a defense that, look, I am a dealer in such goods, and anyone who comes and sells them, I buy. There is no obligation on me to find out whether the person who is selling the goods to me is a thief or not. But if there are a series of such transactions where he keeps on buying stolen goods for the purpose of reselling them and make profit, then his dishonest or the criminal mind is established. Section 15 of the Evidence Act, which deals with the question whether a particular act is committed accidentally or intentionally. You will find the relevancy of these Section 15 in accounting frauds. There was one case which I had an occasion to handle. I will narrate the facts of this case to illustrate the point. There was one accountant working with a hotel, and the hotel in the course of the day used to receive cash from the customers. He was required to deposit that amount every day, the previous day's collection. Now what he used to do, in the slip which he used to submit to the bank while submitting the cash, he used to write a less amount. Suppose he has collected 1,000 rupees, he would write 800. And in the record of the hotel accounts book, he would write 1,000. And this went on for quite some time. Now the question arises, instead of writing 1,000, if he has written 800, it could be accidental. An accountant can make such a mistake. But a series of transactions where the amount shown in the record of the hotel is more and the amount shown in the bank record is less, it can't be accidental. So Section 15 has a great relevancy to find out whether a particular act is accidental or intentional. Then I take you to Section 16. Section 16 has to be read with Section 114 of the Evidence Act. These sections permit the court to draw inferences from facts which are on record. Now, Section 16 is included in the chapter which deals with relevancy of facts. Section 114 is not, but that makes no difference. Section 16 lays down that the court can have regard to the ordinary course of business. Now, let me illustrate this case. A case involving whether a particular letter is posted by X and whether it is received by Y at another place. In the ordinary course of business, once you show that there is posting, there can be a presumption that it reached Y at another place. Now, therefore, posting of the letter is a relevant fact and therefore admissible. Now, there could be a variety of such circumstances where there may not be a direct evidence, but a certain fact once established which has a bearing on the fact which you are trying to probe into, it can be a relevant fact. I have given you an obvious example. Then you come to, I will come to section 114 a little later. But section 16 and 114 are sections which empower the court to draw inferences from certain facts which are relevant. And the inference also becomes a relevant fact. Then we go to the provisions relating to sections 24 to 30. Section 24 to 30 deal with the confession. Section 24 lays down that an accused can't be induced by any person or can't be threatened by any person, not necessarily a police officer, to make confession. If the confession is the result of threat, coercion, etc., then such confession is not admissible in evidence. This is relevant as far as extrajudicial confessions are concerned. Section 25 says a confession made to a police officer is not admissible in evidence, subject, of course, to any special law. We saw in case of Tada that such confessions were made admissible. Then, section 26 deals with the confession made by a person while in the custody of a police officer. He need not be making a confession to the police officer directly, but as long as he is in the custody of the police officer, even a confession made to a third person is not admissible in evidence. Then you come to section 27, a very important provision in the criminal law. What does section 27 lay down? It's an exception to the rules contained in section 24, 25, 26, 24 to 26. What does that mean? It means that if on an information given by the accused to the police officer, it leads to a discovery of an incriminating material against the accused. In other words, it partially lifts the ban which is imposed by sections 25 and 26. Let's take an example. In any offense, take for example an offense of theft, where he has stolen the goods or any article of importance, and he has hidden it somewhere. Now he gives information to the police that the stolen articles lie at a particular place. And on the basis of that information, the police officer goes and finds, yes, at that particular place, the articles were hidden. This applies to this principle applies to what is known as corpus delicti. Now, what is corpus delicti? There is a popular misconception that a corpus delicti means the dead body. No. Dead body is one of the species of corpus delicti. Now, a person commits a murder and tries to hide the dead body. And the information that he gives to the police leads to the discovery of the place where the dead body is hidden. So since this expression is used, often is used in murder cases, the common law, the common man's perception, or even amongst the lawyers, the perception is corpus delicti means the dead body. Actually, it means anything which is the object of offense. So object of offense can be stolen goods or it can be a dead body. Now, there are rules which the courts have evolved. That under what circumstances section 27 can be pressed into service by the prosecution. First obvious test is that there is a connection between the information and the discovery. The second rule which the courts have evolved is that if the place where the article is found or the dead body is found is something which the perpetrator of the offense alone could have known. These are some of the tests which the courts have. Now, the information which the accused gives to the police may have two elements. One is information which directly relates to discovery, and the other incriminating may be having the color of a confession of the offense. Now, if he says that I committed the murder and I kept the dead body at such and such place, then I committed the murder is not within the purview of section 27, but the place where he has hidden is within the purview of 27. So sometimes the dividing line between what is admissible under 27 and what is not admissible under 27 becomes sometimes too thin to be perceived. But nevertheless, it exists in the eyes of law. Then we come to section 30. A confession made by a co-accused can be used not only against him, but also against the co-accused. Now the courts have evolved some principles because the person who makes a confession is an accomplice. And the question of his giving evidence arises only under section 133 of the Evidence Act when he has been granted reprieve or has been granted pardon. It's a human tendency. When a co-conspirator or a co-accused wants to make a confession, he will try to minimize his role and will try to introduce exculpatory elements in as far as his role is concerned. But as far as the role of the co-accused is concerned, he will try to inflate. So the courts have evolved principles how to analyze his evidence and separate the grain from the chaff, as the well-known expression goes. Now, we come to expert evidence under section 45 of the Evidence Act. It relates to so many scientific matters. Now, there are number of judgments on this point. I'll just give you medical evidence because often medical evidence acquires some importance in cases of murder. The courts have laid down one important principle, that if there are two conflicting opinions of doctors as to the cause of death, then the Supreme Court says, or that seems to be the settled position, subject of course to exceptions, that the person who performed the post-mortem operation, his opinion must have primacy. Subject, of course, to two things, that he has a motive or that his opinion is so palpably absurd. So in case of conflicting opinions, the primacy is that of the one who performed the postmortem operation. Now take handwriting experts. Now, courts have recognized that the handwriting experts' opinion is a very weak piece of evidence, because this is not a science, perfect science in any case. On the basis of the same material, the two handwriting experts can come to vastly different conclusions. What are the methods that they use? They first take the admitted handwriting and they blow it up. Then they take the disputed handwriting and blow it up, and then compare, and they see what is the stroke, whether how firm is writing. All these parameters do not have a scientific precision. They are more in the nature of conjecture, guesswork, opinion. See, there are two types of opinions. One which is based on scientific principles, absolutely, and the other which involves a lot of guesswork. Even opinions which are based on scientific principles do contain a measure of guesswork, but the area of guesswork there is extremely limited. Because when a medical officer does the postmortem, there are well-known parameters which enable him to find out the cause of death. The medical science also does not have the precision of mathematics, but it is based on certain scientific principles. So there the guesswork has a very limited range, but in matter relating to handwriting, there is a vast space. And therefore, the court has to be extremely careful in accepting or rejecting the evidence of so-called. In fact, ultimately, as far as handwriting is concerned, the courts have recognized that the court itself can see with its own eyes the disputed handwriting and the admitted handwriting and come to its own conclusion. Now, there are several other provisions, but because of the time constraint, I will deal with the documentary evidence. Now, documentary evidence in a criminal trial, take for example Panchanama. You will not find any specific provision in the Evidence Act which deals with Panchanama. But what is a Panchanama? This is the record of what a Panch witness has seen. Now, this is a part of investigation. When the police officer starts investigation and he discovers something, take for example, Section 27 Evidence Act discovery. How does he record this discovery? He has to have who are supposed to be independent persons.
चलो छोड़
Problem?
लगाए लगे
Hello? Hello? Am I audible?
या
Thank you.
जी सर
Now, the Panch evidence in Indian courts is always seen with a lot of suspicion. The reason is that police have their own set of panchas, and they sometimes do not take them to the incident where the Panchanama is to be carried out. The Panchanamas are prepared at the police station and the Panchas generally sign it. Now, the Panchanama is not proved until the prosecution examines one of the Panch witnesses. Now, that is the proof of the Panchanama, that is the document. Now, Section 67 and other provisions of the Chapter 5 of the Evidence Act do not directly deal with the truth or the correctness of what is recorded in the document. So what is recorded in the Panchanama, whether the contents are true, false, correct or incorrect, is something that Pancha, witness, must depose orally before the court. A mere production of the Panchanama and mere identification of the signature of the Panchas and others is not enough. This one important principle flows from several judgments of the High Courts and the Supreme Court, which I'll just briefly indicate to you what those judgments are. Because the law of evidence recognizes a difference of a substantial nature between the proof of contents of the document and the proof of the truth of the contents. Now, when Panchanama is proved, you have only proved the contents. But in order to prove the truth of the contents, that is the truth, what is stated in the Panchanama, the Pancha must prove that by oral evidence. And on this aspect, there are a series of judgments of the Bombay High Court, 1967 Maharashtra Law Journal, page 65, 56 Bombay Law Report 147, 1974 SCC Supreme Court, page 707, AIR 1982 Bombay, page 38, AIR 1983 Bombay, page 1. Now, this is an important aspect. Now, let's take the identification parade. Now, identification parade relates to section 9 of the Evidence Act. Now, there are two important principles. Mr. Kadam, do I have still time or? Hello?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Continue, sir. No issue.
Because we are completed on. I'll try to briefly summarize that identification parade is of great importance when the accused is not known to the eyewitnesses previously. If he is known to the eyewitnesses, then not holding an identification parade or not proving the identification parade is not fatal to the prosecution case. Now, the courts have laid down number of norms relating to identification parade. Some of these norms are: first, whether the eyewitness previously knew the accused. This is some material for cross-examination. What was the time lag between the commission of the offense and the identification parade? The reason is, the longer the time, the greater is the possibility of the eyewitness being tutored to identify the witness. Next is whether the test is fair. Now, how do you establish a fair test? If a particular accused person is to be identified, then he has to be mixed up with other persons who are not accused and whose general get-up, their skin color, their facial features, their height, their structure is somewhat similar. If this is not complied with, then the test may not be fair. But it again depends upon the facts of each case. It also depends upon where the identification parade was carried out and where the offense took place, and where the offense took place, whether there was sufficient light, and where the identification parade is carried out, whether there was sufficient light. And one important aspect is that what is the important feature of the accused which got impressed on the mind of the identifier. There are several such norms which the courts have evolved. Then I have dealt with the medical evidence, but there is one important aspect of medical evidence which I must, one is the medical evidence and circumstantial evidence. In one Karnataka case, the medical evidence indicated that the death of the person, victim, is not due to poisoning. But the entire circumstantial evidence clearly indicated that it was a case of poisoning. Now, if the circumstantial evidence is of a very strong nature, then the court need not go by the medical evidence, and the court can go and accept the circumstantial evidence. This was recognized by the Karnataka High Court in the judgment reported in 1995 Criminal Law Journal 1964. Now, this was in the case of poisoning, where the medical evidence is of great importance. Now, the difference between medical evidence and ocular evidence, or the evidence of eyewitnesses. Now, the judgments run into a legend. Now, if the court finds that the evidence of the eyewitnesses is reliable, then the court need not go by a contrary opinion of the doctor. This you will find in one of the leading judgments, AIR 1994 Supreme Court, page 748. And the conflict between the opinions of two doctors, to which I made an earlier reference, the Supreme Court judgment is 1997, volume 7 SCC, page 156. Now, I can go on as far as the Evidence Act is concerned. But before I take you to the appreciation of evidence, I must again emphasize that the foundation of Evidence Act and the foundation of the whole law of evidence is based on principle of best evidence. And this is amply illustrated by section 114 of the Evidence Act. Now, take for example, the prosecution is in possession of certain material evidence. Prosecution does not produce it before the court. The court is entitled to draw an adverse inference against the prosecution. Why? The reason is that a party in possession of a best evidence is under an obligation to produce it, irrespective of the question whether the burden or onus lies on that party or not. This is laid down by Supreme Court, maybe in a reference to a civil case, but this is a fundamental principle of law evidence. You see the judgment of the Supreme Court in AIR 1968 Supreme Court, page 1413. Now I take you to the realm of appreciation of evidence. Now this realm has no borders. It's an uncharted waters. But the courts have attempted to evolve some principles. Let me indicate what those principles are. First is last seen. Very often in a murder cases, there is no eyewitness, direct eyewitness, who has seen the commission of the offense. Now, in such circumstances, a person who is last seen with the deceased is often accused. Now, this is a circumstantial evidence. And one of the fundamental rules of circumstantial evidence is that there should be no circumstance which indicates towards the innocence of the accused. In other words, the circumstantial evidence must eliminate every hypothesis which is consistent with the innocence of the accused. In other words, the circumstantial evidence must be of a very comprehensive nature. So you will find judgments galore. Some judgments will indicate last seen together is good enough. Some judgments will say that by itself is not sufficient. You can see the law discussed on this point is AR 1979 Supreme Court 1620. Now, what could be the other circumstances? Number of them. For example, the blood found on his body or on his clothes, or the weapon found in his possession, which carries the blood of the deceased. Other circumstances can be motive. So there could be variety of other circumstances which would corroborate the thesis, the last seen together. Then injuries on accused is a circumstance in favor of the accused. Often there are scuffles and the accused also suffers injuries. There the injuries can be of different types. It can be a self-inflicted. Some of the accused are so intelligent that in order to create a false defense, that they were acting in self-defense and the deceased was the aggressor, or that the other party was the aggressor, they may have some self-inflicted injuries. Now there the court has to be very careful whether those injuries are superficial, minor, or of a serious nature. No absolute rule can be laid down, but these are some norms. Then a basic principle in law of evidence, falsus in uno, falsus in omnibus. This is recognized in AR 1978 Supreme Court page 1096. The principle says that once the witness is found to have made one false statement, then his entire evidence should be disbelieved. Supreme Court has negated this. Supreme Court says that one false statement does not empower the court to discard his entire evidence. So this maxim, falsus in uno, falsus in omnibus, is not applicable uniformly. It depends upon facts of each case, and this is what the Apex Court has laid down in AR 1978 Supreme Court 1096. Now, the reason is very simple. Every witness sometimes suffers from lapse of memory. He may forget, for example, the time. It depends upon the time lag between the commission of the offense and his evidence. When I started my practice, the criminal trial of murder used to start within 1 or 2 years. Now I find, at least from matters which come to the Supreme Court, that the murder trials do not even start for 5 years, 7 years, in some states even not 10 years. Now, because of this huge time gap between the date of the incident and the date on which the eyewitness's statement was recorded by the police under 161 and the date on which he comes to give evidence in the court, there is a huge gap. So the human memory may fail, it may fade, and therefore there would be contradictions. Secondly, not only that, the witnesses sometimes have a bit of, they exaggerate or they put an embellishment, they gloss. So the court has to be very careful in examining the evidence and not just go by a simple rule of thumb that because he has made one wrong statement, his evidence should be suspect. But this requires a lot of experience. Now, the most important oral evidence is that of an independent witness. Now, who is an independent witness? The prosecution need not establish it by leading special evidence to show his independence. Supreme Court has recognized that every person is presumed to be independent unless otherwise shown. That is AIR 1992 Supreme Court, page 891. If therefore the accused wants to attack the creditworthiness of the witness on the ground that he is not an independent witness, but is a partisan witness or an interested witness, it is the onus is on the accused to establish circumstances which would indicate his he being an independent or a partisan witness. The same principle applies to an interested party witness. But the question here is, what is the extent of interest and what is the quality of his evidence? Merely because a person is an interested witness, there is no ground to reject his evidence because that will lead to anarchy, chaos. Suppose a person enters somebody else's house and commits an offense. Then the persons in that house would normally be the family members would be the natural witnesses. Then can their evidence be subject to suspicion on the ground that they are interested witnesses or that they are partisan witnesses? They happen to be natural witnesses. Suppose two brothers or two friends or two relatives are walking together and somebody comes and attacks them. The evidence of both would be in a nature of interested evidence. But can you reject? The question is that what is the quality of their evidence? So therefore, by labeling he's an interested witness or is a partisan witness, the accused won't succeed. What accused has to show that he is not a natural witness. So what is the test of a natural witness? That he happens to be present. Now I'll give you an example. It's a reported case of the Supreme Court. I am unable to recall the citation. It was a case where a police officer was accused of murder. The evidence was that this man was picked up from his house and he was brought to an open place and the police officer started beating him. A large crowd gathered. Now, the evidence of the family member was sought to be used by the prosecution for the purpose of showing that the police officer committed the offense of murder. Now, the prosecution must show first that the family member is a natural. What is there to show that that family member was present in an open space? As against that, people who are strangers, who are not family members, who were present, and none of the members of the public which was present at that particular spot was examined. The member of the public would have been the natural witness, would have been the independent witness. And since the prosecution did not examine such a natural witness who is an independent witness, under section 114 of the Evidence Act, an adverse inference was drawn and the testimony of the interested witness of the family member was discarded. So this all depends upon the facts of each case. But the test is natural witness, independent witness, to what extent an interested or a partisan witness, the quality of his evidence, these are all matters to be examined by the court carefully. One important aspect is the bad character of a witness. Now you are all aware that in cross-examination, the defense is entitled to attack the character of the witness. You have sections 148, 149, 155, etc., 154. The question is, to what extent you can, in cross-examination, go on attacking the character. First of all, to attack the character of the witness, the counsel must have a reasonable ground to. He just can't put the questions in air. He must have some information. It is not necessary for him to find out whether that information reflects a true state of facts or otherwise. But he must have a reasonable ground to believe. Now, without reasonable ground, if he starts attacking, it is the duty of the court to stop him. Apart from the fact that the counsel may expose himself to the case of professional misconduct, or even he may expose himself to a possibility, a suit for damages. Because when you are cross-examining a witness and you start attacking his character, the privilege is not absolute, it's a qualified privilege. And if you cross-examine without a foundation, without proper information, without reasonable grounds, you are answerable, the counsel is answerable in damages. Now, usually you will find, especially the punch witnesses, they provide a fertile ground for cross-examination as far as their character is concerned. In fact, in some cases, the courts have even recognized that the punch evidence is very weak. The courts have also recognized that so-called discovery evidence under 27 is also weak, because the witnesses, punch witnesses, are people of not known to be of great reputation. In fact, in one of the judgments, I remember that judgment of Justice Krishna, it is in AR 1978, I forget the page number, where a person who was, that case is known as Paniwala case. That person was vending cold water near Delhi's Red Fort during summer. Now, he was a standard punch witness of the police. And he used to get some money from the police, etc., for doing this dirty job. So, in the course of time, he gave evidence in number of matters, acquired lot of money, and became a respectable man. And he said, now I must stop this business. So when he stopped that business, police started harassing him. Delhi police issued an order to extern him from Delhi, which he challenged by filing a petition in the Supreme Court. And in that writ petition, he produced literally heaps of witness summons issued to him by various courts to give evidence as a punch witness. Now, this is what the state of affairs is. The police have not yet realized the importance of punch witness. The other reason is that people with good reputation, people who are respectable, are not very cooperative. They are reluctant to extend cooperation with the police. Why should I get involved in this lafda? So the police find their stock witnesses as punch witnesses. This is unfortunate state of affairs in this country. Then I have dealt with accomplice under section 133. Then we come to hostile witnesses. Now, this hostile witnesses is a common thing now in Indian courts. Very often, when the accused is a dreaded criminal, when accused is a very powerful and influential, financially, politically, has got a lot of clout, you will find that witness after witness turns hostile. Now, how to deal with these hostile witnesses? By the prosecution. The prosecution has to lead the evidence in examination chief of these witnesses. Now, either in the course of examination in chief or even in the cross-examination, these witnesses start becoming hostile. That is, they give up their case as narrated to the police when the statements under 161 of CRPC were recorded, and they start supporting the version of the defense. Now, in that case, the prosecution is entitled to have them declared as hostile and then start cross-examining them. Now, for the purpose of cross-examining them, section 145 is available to them, to the prosecution. And the hostile witness can be confronted with his earlier statements recorded under section 161. We saw earlier that section 162 does not permit the statements recorded under 161 as evidence, but exceptions are two. One is for the purpose of cross-examination under section 145, and the other is section 32. Then we have evidence under section 32, 33. Now the most important section under section 32 is subsection 1, the dying declaration. The courts have to be very careful in relying upon dying declaration for the simple reason that it's a statement made by a person who is neither examined on oath nor is available for cross-examination. Therefore, the principles of natural justice require that the court has to be extremely careful. And how does the court do that job? First, one, whether the person who made the dying declaration was in a proper mental frame, was in a position to say something intelligently. This depends upon the nature of the injury, nature of the pain that the person is experiencing, then where that dying declaration is recorded, where the dying declaration is recorded, whether any police officer or other persons were present. The one who records the dying declaration has to do a very delicate and an important. The person is able to give intelligent answers to his questions. Second, that there is no one else present where the dying declaration is being recorded to influence the mind of the person making the dying declaration. Now, the dying declaration has been a subject of number of judgments, and it all depends upon the factual matrix. Subject to these fundamental principles, the dying declaration can be a important piece of evidence. The courts have also laid down a test that it is not safe to convict the accused merely on the basis of dying declaration. There should be some kind of corroboration from other evidence. But that is the rule of caution, rule of prudence, and not a rule of law. In certain cases where the character of the dying declaration is such that it inspires confidence, the court may convict the accused merely on the basis of the dying declaration. Now, last aspect of the matter. Two important hints to those who are cross-examining. Number one, that when you cross-examine a prosecution witness, you have to put the essence of your case. What I find often is that the cross-examiner takes the evidence in examination chief and line by line, I put it to you, what you said is false. This is no cross-examination. The cross-examination requires that the accused puts forth the substance of his case and not seek a line-by-line denial. This principle is based on the judgment of the House of Lords in Brown versus Dunn. It's a very old judgment reported in 1893, volume 6R, page 67. This principle was followed by Calcutta High Court in AR 1961, Calcutta, page 359, which is popularly known as Carapet case. This principle is also recognized by the Supreme Court in Harish Loyalka case reported in 2000 2003, volume 1 SCC, page 240. Now, important aspect is that your cross-examination and the statements of the accused under section 313, they must tally. That is, the cross-examination must be on those lines, same as the line which the accused adopts in section 313. My experience tells me that the line of cross-examination is toward the North Pole and accused statement under section 313 is in the South Pole. Now that invites a problem for the accused, because under section 313, though it's not an evidence on oath, the false explanation given by the accused is a circumstance which heavily weighs against him, and the court is entitled to take that into account. And therefore, when you are cross-examining and when the accused is giving his statement under 313 by way of explanation, they both must tally. Now, lastly, one important principle which courts have evolved, and that is authentication by the internal evidence of the document. Of course, this is a principle which was propounded by the well-known jurist Wigmore and Phipson. These are best standard textbooks on the subject. In my opinion, the other Indian books are more or less digests. They only tell you, in this case, Supreme Court decided that, and this case, Supreme Court took a contrary view. But the fundamental principles, the concepts in law of evidence, you will find them in Phipson and Wigmore. I recommend these two books to every lawyer who practices in trial courts. The important case which led to the conviction of an accused on the basis of the internal evidence furnished by the document. This was a document which belonged to the accused himself. And I'll tell you briefly that case. This was a case where the accused was tried for the offense of cheating. Now, this involved also a civil aspect, because there was a correspondence between the accused and the victim of the offense. Now, his letters, which were sought to be relied upon by the prosecution, how do you prove them? That was the question before the prosecution. The rule of best evidence requires that the document must be proved by the one who is the author of that document. The second is that document can be proved by someone who is familiar with his handwriting or with his signature. Now, both these things were not available to the prosecution. But one of his letters, which formed a part of the chain of correspondence between the parties, the courts invoked section 16 and section 114 of the Evidence Act. And having regard to the chain of correspondence, because the correspondence which ensued from the end of the person who was the victim could be proved, and you could also produce the letters which the accused has written. So once the chain of correspondence was established, the court took reliance on section 16 and 114 of the Evidence Act. The court further said that what is written in the letters which are attributed to the accused, that the substance of or the contents of the letters is something which the accused himself would know. In other words, the information contained in those letters was something which could originate only from the accused. So the internal content of the document is a source of proving that document, which is called by Wigmore and Phipson as authentication by internal contents of the document. This is a famous case which is reported in AR 1957 Supreme Court, page 857. Friends, I have tried to cover the very wide range of topics relating to the law of evidence in criminal trials. Ultimately, two things remain: that examination chief, no leading questions; cross-examination, leading questions permitted; cross-examination need not be confined to what the witness has deposed in his examination chief. The cross-examination, the entire thing is at large. And most importantly, in cross-examination, you are entitled to attack the creditworthiness, his credentials of the witness. I have tried to cover as much as possible, but still a vast area of law of evidence relating to the criminal trials still remains outside my lecture. That's my only regret. Thank you very much for giving this opportunity to me to share whatever bit that I have learned in this profession. I conclude my discussion. But still,
Sir, काही question and answer.
law of evidence.
Sir,
Yes.
सर काही क्वेश्चन अँड आन्सर घेणार आहात का व्ह्युअर्सचे?
एक थोडे बहुत घेऊ, because I'm
बरं. चालेल सर, चालेल सर, 2-3 प्रश्न विचारूया.
कारण ग्रहण चालू आहे आता, त्याची वाट बघतोय कधी संपेल.
ओके ओके सर.
No
I have a
problem.
question.
Some questions. Yeah.
I have a question, sir.
Yes.
Advocate Lugani here.
Yes.
Sir, I just want to know some case of dying declaration in burn injuries.
Now,
Burn injuries.
yes,
where
burn
the-
injury is a bit of
Sir, please.
yes.
Sir, the accident. Sir,
Yes, I'm hearing you.
between the date of accident and between the date of death, usually there is a big time gap. And there is all chances of relatives influencing him, and the pain is less. So how much it can be relied upon?
You see, as I have indicated, there are no absolute norms. It depends upon fact situation. Now, first is case of burn injuries. What is the extent of the injury? 80%, 70%, 90%. Even if the burn injuries are for, there are people, there are patients who are mentally alert. They are experiencing excruciating pain. Now, there the doctor's evidence. What is the extent? Hello.
Yes sir, continue sir.
That will, the quality of that dying declaration will depend upon what the doctors say. See, in burn injuries which are of a very high order, there is hardly any time lag between sustaining the injury and the death. Not necessarily. It depends upon the capacity of, the medical science tells us, it depends upon the capacity of the person, the victim, to sustain that kind of injury. There are cases where a person sustains that injury for a longer time. So this is all fact situation, and dying declaration judgments, if you try to count, even of the Supreme Court and the Privy Council, the number runs into thousands.
Yes, Narayan sir.
Yes.
Yes, there is question from Narayan sir.
Yes, I am listening.
Yes. Wait sir. Sagar Kole sir.
Yes, sir. First of all, thank you so much for this wonderful lecture. My question is that, sir, if a body of disease is not found during a course of investigation and charge sheet came to be filed without a PM note, so prosecution how to be proved without cause of death? his case?
This is corpus delicti, section 9 of the Evidence Act. Now, there is no basic fundamental rule that the dead body must be found. That's a circumstance which is in the favor of the accused, and the dead body is not found. But if the evidence of eyewitnesses is crystal clear and is unimpeachable, then in my view, even though the dead body is not found, the prosecution can succeed. It all depends upon facts of each case.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much.
थँक्स अ लॉट सर. आज सरांनी आपल्याला खूपच महत्वाची अशी फौजदारी कायद्यावरती माहिती दिलेली आहे. सरांचे पुण्य धन्यवाद. आणि संघटनेतर्फे मी आमचे चेअरपर्सन पूजा सिंग मॅडम यांना विनंती करतो की त्यांनी ऑफिशियली वोट ऑफ थँक्स द्यावे. पूजा सिंग, चेअरपर्सन ठाणे भाग.
Namaskar. This is Advocate Pooja Kadam, the chairpersons of Thane District Court Bar Associations. Good afternoon, all. Firstly, I would like to be very thankful to Shekhar sir who given us his very valuable time in these lockdown periods. Sir, you are really very nice presented the various informations on the topics of Evidence Act. As we all know, it is the main mirrors of the case. Sir, you presented each and every section very nicely. It's really useful for all the advocates in their practice life. In very short periods, you covered all the topics of Evidence Act, that is the cross-examinations, identification parade, punch witness, hostile witness, and all things, relevancy of the fact and non-relevance. Thank you so much, sir, for presenting and giving a very nice lecture. Thank you once again. Thank you so much. I would also like to thank all the respective members, seniors as well as juniors who joined us and who attending these programs. Thank you so much. I would also like to thank our respective president, vice president, joint secretary and all respective members who arranged the lecture series for all of us. There is the one thing which I am glad to inform you all. The next lecture will be presented by the Honorable Justice, Honorable High Court Justice Sri R.G. Ketkar sir, and the topic is powers of municipal corporations under the various act to actions against the unauthorized constructions and defense available to parties. This is on dated 28 June 2020. Again, one thing which I want to tell you, our all lecture series you all can see on YouTube on the sites of Thane District Court Bar Associations, previous as well as present. Now I am going to declare the end of this program, but we'll back very soon with a new topic and with a new perspective. Thank you so much. Thanks to all.